Hey there, fellow myth lovers. Tonight, we're going somewhere special together. Somewhere far from notifications and deadlines and that weird stress knot in your shoulders. So here's what I need you to do. Close your laptop if you can, or at least dim that screen. Let the blue light fade away. Take a breath. Feel yourself sink into whatever you're sitting or lying on. Now close your eyes and let me take you back. Way back. To a time when gods walked among mortals, when lightning was personal, and when family drama could literally shake the foundations of the earth. Tonight's story isn't just entertainment. It's ancient wisdom wrapped in divine chaos. It's the biography of Zeus, king of the gods, master of the sky, and quite possibly history's most complicated family man. But this isn't your typical mythology lecture. This is a bedtime story for grown-ups who need to remember that even gods struggled with daddy issues, relationship drama, and the corrupting nature of absolute power. So let the world outside fade away. Let your breathing slow down. And let's begin with a baby who was almost eaten alive. Picture this scene in your mind's eye. A newborn baby, still wrinkled and pink, making those soft little sounds that melt hearts across the cosmos. Now imagine that this baby's father has a very unusual parenting philosophy. One that involves treating his children like appetizers. This is how Zeus entered the world. Not with fanfare or celebration, but with his mother Rhea clutching him to her chest, knowing that in moments, she would have to choose between keeping her child and keeping him alive. Cronus wasn't your typical deadbeat dad. He was worse. He was a deadbeat dad with a prophecy hanging over his head and absolutely zero emotional intelligence. Here's what had happened. After overthrowing his own father Uranus in a coup that makes Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie, Cronus received some unwelcome news from the universe's cosmic customer service department. Congratulations on your hostile takeover. By the way, one of your kids is going to do the exact same thing to you. Have a nice day. Cronus's response to this information was, let's call it creative. Instead of maybe going to therapy, or perhaps just being a better father than his own father had been, he decided the solution was simple. No children, no problem. And since gods are immortal and can't exactly be sent away to boarding school, his method was swallowing them whole the moment they were born. One by one, Rhea watched her children disappear down her husband's throat. Hestia, gentle and kind, gone. Demeter, who would have made the earth bloom, swallowed. Hera, destined to be a queen, eaten. Hades, who would rule the underworld with quiet dignity, consumed. Poseidon, future lord of the seas, devoured. Each birth became a tragedy. Each delivery, a funeral. But when Zeus was born, something in Rhea snapped. Maybe it was mother's intuition. Maybe it was divine intervention. Or maybe she just reached that point every parent knows. The moment when you realize you'll do absolutely anything, no matter how crazy it seems, to protect your child. So she hatched a plan. While Cronus waited outside the birthing chamber, probably working up an appetite, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes. She made it look exactly like a newborn baby. Then she handed it to her husband and held her breath. Cronus, either too eager or too arrogant to inspect his meal, swallowed the rock without a second thought. Problem solved, right? Another potential usurper eliminated. He had no idea that the real Zeus was already gone, spirited away in the dark of night to the island of Crete. There, in a cave high on Mount Ida, Zeus began his secret childhood. The cave was hidden, protected by ancient magic and fierce guardians. Warrior nymphs called the Curides clashed their shields and spears outside, creating such a racket that baby Zeus's cries would never be heard by his father's spies. He was fed by Amalthea, a goat whose milk was said to contain liquid starlight. Some versions of the story say Amalthea was actually a nymph who could transform into a goat. Others insist she was a magical goat who could speak. Either way, she became the mother Zeus had lost, nursing him with milk that made him grow stronger, faster, and more divine than any ordinary baby. The cave became Zeus's entire world. Its walls echoed with whispered stories of his siblings, trapped in their father's darkness. The nymphs who protected him told him tales of the world outside of mortal humans who lived and died in the span of heartbeats, of forests and oceans and mountains, of the sun and moon that danced across the sky under his father's rule. But most importantly, they told him the truth: that his father was a tyrant, that his siblings were prisoners, that the world above was ruled by fear rather than love, by paranoia rather than wisdom. Zeus listened to every word. As he grew from baby to child to young god, these stories shaped his understanding of power, of family, of responsibility. He began to dream not just of rescuing his siblings, but of building something better. Something that would never again require a mother to choose between watching her child die and watching him disappear forever. The irony of Cronus's actions becomes clear when you think about it. In trying to prevent his own downfall, he guaranteed it. By eating his children, he created the very enemy he feared. By ruling through terror, he ensured that when someone finally challenged him, they would be motivated not by ambition but by justice. Zeus grew up in that cave knowing that power without love becomes tyranny, that fear without wisdom becomes paranoia, and that sometimes, to save the people you care about, you have to be willing to fight the person who was supposed to protect them. Every day he trained. The warrior nymphs taught him to fight with sword and spear, to move like lightning, to strike like thunder. His grandmother Gaia, the earth herself, whispered strategies in his dreams. The goat Amalthea shared not just her milk but her ancient wisdom about the natural order of things. And slowly, carefully, Zeus began to plan. Not just an escape, but a revolution. Not just a rescue, but a complete transformation of how power would work in the cosmos. The boy who had almost become his father's dinner was growing into something Cronus couldn't have imagined. Not just a son, but a reckoning. Not just a child, but the future itself, hidden away in a cave, preparing to change everything. Years passed in the hidden cave and Zeus grew. Not just in size, but in understanding. The child who had once been marked for death was becoming something his father could never have anticipated, a leader who understood both power and its price. When Zeus finally emerged from the cave as a young man, he didn't burst forth like some comic book hero ready to punch his way to victory. No, Zeus was smarter than that. He had learned patience from his years of hiding, strategy from his grandmother Gaia, and most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't strength, it's timing. His first challenge was getting close to Cronus without being recognized. This required what we might call today a very deep cover operation. Zeus disguised himself as a servant, just another face in the cosmic court of his father. He learned to bow his head, to keep his voice quiet, to blend into the background while his eyes and ears recorded everything. For months, Zeus served wine to the father who had tried to eat him. He cleaned floors that his siblings' feet should have walked. He listened to Cronus boast about his wisdom, his strength, his perfect solution to the problem of prophecy. All while planning the most spectacular family reunion in mythological history. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Gaia, his grandmother, provided Zeus with an ancient potion. Not deadly gods are remarkably hard to kill, but something far more appropriate. An emetic so powerful it would force Cronus to vomit up everything he had ever swallowed. Picture the scene. Cronus, lord of time itself, sitting on his throne, accepting a cup of wine from his unassuming servant. The liquid slides down his throat, warm and familiar. For a moment, nothing happens. Then comes the rumbling. Deep in his divine stomach, something is very, very wrong. What followed was perhaps the most undignified moment in the history of divine rulership. Cronus began to retch. Not politely, not quietly, but with the force of cosmic upheaval. The sound echoed through the halls of power like an earthquake made of nausea. And then, one by one, Zeus's siblings came up. First came the stone, the decoy baby that had fooled Cronus years ago. Then came the children, fully grown now after their years in digestive prison. Hestia, blinking in the light. Demeter, still clutching seeds from her interrupted childhood. Hera, furious and ready for revenge. Hades, pale but unbroken. Poseidon, with storm clouds already gathering around him. The reunion was brief but electric. These siblings hadn't seen each other since birth. They barely knew each other's faces. But they knew each other's pain. They had all been shaped by the same trauma, marked by the same loss. Zeus stood before them, no longer disguised, no longer hidden. "Brothers," he said. "Sisters. Our father thought he could prevent prophecy by swallowing it. Instead, he's just given us time to grow strong." What followed was not a battle, but a war. The Titanomachy, the war between the old gods and the new, would rage for 10 years. A decade of cosmic violence that would reshape not just who ruled the heavens, but how power itself would be understood. But here's what made this war different from every other struggle for power in mythology. Zeus didn't fight just to become the next tyrant. He fought to build something better. Something that wouldn't require parents to hide their children or children to poison their parents. The war wasn't won through strength alone, though there was plenty of that. It was won through alliance building, through strategy, through Zeus's ability to inspire others to believe in a different kind of future. His first major strategic victory came when he descended into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, to free the Cyclopes and the Centimanes, monsters that Uranus and later Cronus had imprisoned because they were too powerful to control. These weren't typical rescue missions. These were beings that had been chained in darkness for eons, forgotten and bitter. Zeus didn't just free them, he offered them something Cronus never had. Respect. A voice in the new order. A place where their power would be valued rather than feared. The Cyclopes, master smiths of the divine realm, were so grateful they forged weapons for Zeus and his siblings that would become legendary. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, not just a weapon, but a symbol of his authority over the forces of nature. For Poseidon, a trident that could shake the earth and command the seas. For Hades, a helmet of invisibility that would make him master of stealth and shadow. The Centimanes, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, became Zeus's most powerful allies. These were beings that could fight entire armies single-handedly, and they chose to fight for Zeus not because he commanded them, but because he had shown them dignity. This is where Zeus began to reveal his genius as a leader. He understood that lasting power comes not from fear but from loyalty. Not from hoarding strength but from sharing it. Not from ruling over others but from convincing them to fight alongside you. The war raged across sky and sea and underworld. Mountains shattered. Oceans boiled. The very fabric of reality stretched and groaned under the pressure of cosmic combat. Mortals cowered in caves, wondering if the world itself might tear apart. But slowly, inevitably, the tide began to turn. Not because Zeus was stronger than Cronus, though he was. Not because he was smarter, though he was that too. But because he offered his followers something Cronus couldn't: hope for a better future rather than just fear of change. One by one, the Titans fell. Some were defeated in combat. Others simply switched sides when they realized which way the wind was blowing. The few who remained loyal to Cronus found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting not just against Zeus's armies but against the momentum of history itself. The final battle came when Zeus faced his father directly. This wasn't Hollywood drama, no lengthy speeches about family and forgiveness. This was divine combat in its purest form. Lightning against time. Thunder against tyranny. The future against the past. When Cronus fell, it wasn't with the dramatic death of a mortal king. Gods don't die so easily. Instead, he was bound in chains forged by the Cyclopes and cast into Tartarus, joining the monsters and titans who had fallen before him. The king who had devoured his children to prevent his overthrow had been overthrown anyway, just as the prophecy had foretold. But Zeus's victory came with a choice. He could become the new Cronus, rule through fear, hoard power, eliminate threats before they could challenge him. The pattern of divine succession seemed to demand it. Son defeats father, becomes father, fears son. Or he could break the cycle. Standing among the ruins of his father's empire, Zeus made a decision that would shape the next age of the world. Instead of ruling alone, he would share power. Instead of hoarding authority, he would delegate it. Instead of fearing change, he would institutionalize it. The cosmos was divided among the three brothers. Zeus took the sky, not just as ruler, but as the space where weather was born, where storms gathered, where the forces that shaped mortal life originated. Poseidon claimed the seas, vast and unpredictable, full of hidden depths and sudden storms. Hades accepted the underworld, the realm of the dead, where every mortal story eventually ended. The earth itself remained common ground, shared among all the gods. This wasn't just practical politics, it was a statement of philosophy. No single deity would have absolute control over the mortal realm. Power would be balanced, distributed, checked. It was an imperfect system, as all systems are. Zeus would make mistakes, spectacular ones. He would let power corrupt him in new ways. He would create new problems even as he solved old ones. But in that moment of victory, choosing cooperation over domination, Zeus transformed not just his own destiny but the nature of divine rule itself. The age of the Titans was over. The age of the Olympians had begun. And in the quiet moments after victory, when the thunder had faded and the smoke had cleared, Zeus finally had a chance to truly talk with his siblings. To learn their names, their personalities, their dreams for the future they would build together. They were no longer the swallowed children of a tyrant king. They were the founding generation of a new order. And their story was just beginning. The victory celebration didn't last long. As any new leader quickly discovers, winning the revolution is the easy part. Actually running things afterward? That's where the real work begins. Zeus found himself in a position that would make any modern CEO break out in stress hives. He had just inherited a cosmic empire in complete chaos. The Titans were either imprisoned or scattered. The natural order of things had been completely disrupted. Mortals were hiding in caves, unsure whether the sun would rise tomorrow. And his siblings, despite their shared trauma, had very different ideas about what their new world should look like. But Zeus had learned something crucial during his years in the cave and his time fighting the war. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about bringing together people who do. His first decision was choosing a headquarters. Cronus had ruled from various strongholds, never quite trusting any single location. Zeus chose Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, literally above the clouds, visible from vast distances. It was a statement of philosophy as much as geography. The new rulers wouldn't hide. They would be visible, accessible, present in the world they governed. But Olympus wasn't just chosen for its height. It was strategic. High enough to survey the mortal world below. Close enough to respond quickly to crises. Remote enough to maintain divine dignity. And beautiful enough to inspire awe in anyone who made the long journey to its peak. Zeus didn't just claim Olympus, he transformed it. With the help of the Cyclopes and the magic available to divine beings, he built a palace complex that defied mortal understanding. Architecture that seemed to flow rather than stand. Halls that echoed with celestial music. Gardens where ambrosia grew alongside flowers that bloomed in harmony with the phases of the moon. This wasn't just royal luxury. It was divine infrastructure. Every detail was designed to support the work of governing a cosmos. Meeting halls where disputes could be settled. War rooms where threats could be analyzed. Feast halls where alliances could be forged over divine wine. But the real genius of Zeus's Olympus was how it balanced grandeur with accessibility. Unlike earthly palaces that were designed to keep people out, Olympus was designed to bring the right people in. Heroes seeking divine aid could petition the gods directly. Mortals with offerings could present them in person. Even other divine beings had clear protocols for visiting and addressing the new cosmic government. Once the physical infrastructure was in place, Zeus faced his next challenge: personnel management. And if you think your workplace has difficult personalities, imagine trying to run a government where everyone has supernatural powers and several thousand years of unresolved trauma. His siblings each brought unique skills and equally unique complications to the new administration. Hestia was quiet, reliable, and completely uninterested in power politics. She claimed the role of maintaining the sacred hearth, both literally keeping the fires burning and metaphorically maintaining the spiritual center of Olympus. It was exactly the job she wanted, important but behind the scenes. Demeter had emerged from Cronus's stomach with an unshakable connection to the earth and growing things. She became the goddess of agriculture, the harvest, the seasons themselves. But she also carried deep trauma from her imprisonment, manifesting as protective instincts so fierce they would later cause global climate disasters whenever anyone threatened her daughter. Hera presented Zeus with a different challenge. She was brilliant, politically savvy, and absolutely determined never to be powerless again. The years trapped in darkness had given her time to think about leadership, justice, and what divine authority should look like. She also had very strong opinions about how Zeus should conduct himself as king, opinions that would shape their relationship for millennia to come. Hades chose a path that surprised everyone. Instead of competing for authority on Olympus, he accepted dominion over the underworld. This wasn't a consolation prize. It was recognition that someone had to manage the realm of the dead, and it required someone with patience, impartiality, and an understanding that death was not evil, just inevitable. His kingdom beneath the earth became a model of efficient administration. Souls were judged fairly. Punishments fit crimes. The dead found peace or appropriate consequences based on how they had lived. It was perhaps the most morally consistent part of the entire divine government. Poseidon took the seas, and with them a personality perfectly suited to his domain. Powerful, unpredictable, capable of both nurturing life and destroying it without warning. His underwater palace became legendary for its beauty, and his temper became equally legendary for its suddenness. As Zeus watched his siblings establish their own domains, he began to understand something crucial about leadership that would define his reign. The best way to maintain power is to give it away strategically. By allowing his siblings to become authorities in their own right, he didn't weaken his position as king. He strengthened it by creating a government based on expertise rather than just force. But Zeus wasn't content to rule only with family. The new age needed new gods, divine beings who could handle the complexities of a changing world. Some arose naturally from the forces Zeus had set in motion. Others were recruited, promoted from minor deities or elevated from mortal status based on their exceptional abilities. Athena's birth from Zeus's head, literally emerging fully grown and armed from his skull, might sound like the ultimate migraine, but it represented something profound about Zeus's approach to power. He was willing to create gods who might challenge him intellectually, who brought wisdom rather than just strength to cosmic governance. Apollo and Artemis, born to Leto after one of Zeus's many extramarital adventures, became the divine twins of prophecy and hunting. Their birth story, with Hera forbidding any land from sheltering Leto, revealed both Zeus's weakness for mortal women and the family dynamics that would define Olympian politics. Each new god added complexity to the divine government, but also capacity. Hermes became the messenger, the negotiator, the god who could move between realms and translate between different kinds of beings. Aphrodite brought understanding of love, beauty, and the emotional forces that drove both mortal and divine behavior. Gradually, what emerged on Olympus wasn't just a royal court, but something closer to a divine cabinet. Each god had areas of expertise. Each brought different perspectives to cosmic problems. When issues arose, and they always did, Zeus could convene councils that included genuine experts rather than just yes-men. This collaborative approach distinguished Zeus's rule from his predecessors. Uranus had ruled through distance, literally staying in the sky while his children suffered on Earth. Cronus had ruled through paranoia, seeing threats everywhere and trusting no one. Zeus chose to rule through delegation, expertise, and careful coalition building. It wasn't perfect. Gods still quarreled, still competed for influence, still let personal grudges affect their professional decisions. But the system was resilient. When individual gods made mistakes, and they all did, the distributed nature of divine authority meant that other gods could step in to correct course. The establishment of this divine government had profound effects on the mortal world below. Instead of arbitrary divine whims, humans began to see patterns in how the gods behaved. Justice became more predictable. Natural forces, while still dangerous, followed rules that mortals could begin to understand and work with. Agriculture flourished under Demeter's guidance. Trade expanded under Hermes' protection. Arts and crafts developed under Athena's inspiration. The seas became navigable under Poseidon's, admittedly moody, authority. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Mortals no longer lived in terror of their gods eating them or their world being destroyed on a whim. They began to see the divine realm as something they could interact with through proper channels: prayer, sacrifice, heroic deeds, artistic achievement. This opened up entirely new possibilities for human development. Cities could grow without fear of arbitrary divine destruction. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. Culture could develop beyond mere survival. The age of divine chaos was ending. The age of divine civilization had begun. And Zeus, the baby who had once hidden in a cave to avoid being his father's dinner, had become the architect of a new cosmic order. But with great power comes great temptation. And Zeus was about to discover that being a good revolutionary doesn't automatically make you a good king. Here's where our story takes a turn. Not the dramatic, obvious kind of turn where the hero suddenly becomes a villain in Act 3. No, this is subtler. More human in the way that even gods can be human in their flaws. Zeus, you see, had spent his entire life fighting tyranny. Fighting his grandfather's cruelty. Fighting his father's paranoia. Fighting the old order's corruption. He had sworn to be different. To be better. To create a system based on justice rather than fear. And for a while, he succeeded brilliantly. The early years of his reign were marked by wisdom, collaboration, and genuine care for both divine and mortal welfare. He established laws that made sense. He created systems that worked. He brought order to chaos without becoming a tyrant himself. But power has a strange effect on people. It starts slowly, almost imperceptibly. First, it's just the small conveniences. Why should the king of the gods have to wait in line? Why should he have to explain every decision to subordinates? Why shouldn't the most powerful being in the cosmos enjoy some special privileges? Then it escalates. The exceptions become the rule. The special privileges become expectations. The collaboration becomes consultation, then suggestion, then mere formality. Zeus discovered what every leader eventually learns. It's easier to give orders than to build consensus. Faster to impose solutions than to negotiate them. More satisfying to be feared than to be questioned. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost gentle in its progression. Like a slowly rising tide, it crept up so gradually that by the time anyone noticed, the landscape had completely changed. The first major sign came with his marriage to Hera. This should have been a partnership of equals. Hera was brilliant, experienced, fully capable of being a true co-ruler. She understood divine politics, mortal psychology, and the delicate balance required to govern a cosmos. But Zeus approached the marriage like a political alliance rather than a personal relationship. Hera would be queen, yes, but it would be his kingdom she was queen of. She would have authority, but it would be authority he delegated to her. She would be his partner, but junior partner. Hera, who had emerged from their father's stomach with very clear ideas about never being powerless again, was not amused by this arrangement. But the wedding had already happened. The political benefits were already being realized. The public face of divine unity was already established. So began what might be the longest-running marriage counseling case in mythological history. Two brilliant, powerful beings locked in a relationship that brought out both their best qualities and their absolute worst. But Hera's frustrated ambitions were only the beginning of Zeus's problems with power. The real trouble started when he began to notice mortal women. Now, to be fair to Zeus, this wasn't initially about sexual conquest or dominance. The early attractions were often genuine. He would see a mortal woman, usually one who was particularly beautiful, clever, or talented, and become fascinated. Not just with her appearance, but with her humanity, her mortality, the way she experienced life so differently from immortal beings. These fascinations led to relationships. The relationships led to children. And the children created complications that Zeus never fully thought through. When gods have children with mortals, the offspring aren't quite divine and aren't quite human. There's something in between, heroes usually with supernatural strength, divine insight, or magical abilities. But they're also vulnerable in ways that fully divine children aren't. They age, they can be injured, they can die. This should have made Zeus more careful, more protective, more thoughtful about the consequences of his actions. Instead, it seemed to make him more careless. As if the temporary nature of mortal relationships meant they didn't carry the same weight as divine ones. Io, the priestess of Hera who caught Zeus's eye, found herself transformed into a cow to hide her from Hera's jealousy. Europa was carried across the sea on Zeus's back while he was disguised as a bull. Leda encountered Zeus in the form of a swan, leading to one of mythology's more awkward family trees. Each of these stories follows a similar pattern. Zeus sees. Zeus wants. Zeus takes. Zeus disguises his identity or transforms his appearance to avoid complications. And then Zeus moves on, leaving others to deal with the consequences. The mortal women often paid terrible prices for their divine encounters. Exile, transformation, persecution by Hera, or simply the burden of raising semi-divine children in a world that didn't understand them. But Zeus seemed increasingly disconnected from these consequences. The king who had once collaborated with his siblings, who had shared power to prevent tyranny, was becoming someone who took what he wanted without considering the cost to others. Hera watched all of this unfold with growing fury. Not just jealousy, though there was certainly that, but righteous anger at seeing her husband become everything they had once fought against. Her husband was becoming the kind of ruler who believed his own desires mattered more than other people's lives. She couldn't challenge him directly. Zeus was still the king, still the most powerful god on Olympus. But she could make his life complicated. And she did, with a creativity that would have impressed military strategists throughout history. When Zeus pursued Io, Hera sent a gadfly to torment the poor woman across continents. When he seduced Europa, Hera made sure the consequences followed them both. When he fathered children with mortal women, Hera often targeted those children, not out of cruelty toward innocents, but as a way of making Zeus face the real costs of his actions. The most famous victim of this divine marital warfare was Heracles, Zeus's son with the mortal woman Alcmene. Hera's persecution of Heracles, driving him mad, forcing him to perform impossible labors, making his entire life a series of trials, wasn't just jealous spite. It was a pointed lesson about responsibility. Every labor Heracles performed, every monster he fought, every impossible task he completed was essentially Hera asking Zeus, "Is this what your casual affairs are worth? Are you willing to put your own children through hell for your temporary pleasures?" Zeus, for his part, seemed remarkably obtuse about these messages. He would complain about Hera's jealousy while continuing to behave in exactly the ways that provoked it. He would rescue his mortal lovers from immediate danger while ignoring the long-term consequences of his actions. But the marriage between Zeus and Hera reflected a deeper problem in how Zeus was approaching power. He had started his reign by sharing authority, by building consensus, by considering the effects of his decisions on others. Now he was increasingly making unilateral choices based on his personal desires. This shift affected more than just his marriage. It influenced how he interacted with other gods, with mortals, with the basic business of cosmic governance. Take the story of Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with Zeus during the war against Cronus. Prometheus had always been a forward-thinking god, someone who saw potential in humanity that others missed. When he stole fire from the gods to give to mortals, he wasn't being rebellious for its own sake. He was trying to help human civilization develop, to give mortals tools they needed to thrive. The old Zeus, the revolutionary who had understood that good government served its people, might have been willing to negotiate. Maybe fire was too powerful for mortals, but could they find a compromise? Could humans earn access to divine knowledge through proper channels? But the Zeus who received news of Prometheus's theft was no longer that collaborative leader. He was a king whose authority had been challenged, and his response was swift and brutal. Prometheus was chained to a rock where an eagle would devour his liver every day for eternity, the wound healing each night so the torture could begin again. This wasn't justice. It was revenge. And it sent a clear message to everyone watching. Zeus's authority was no longer open to discussion. The punishment of Prometheus marked a turning point in how mortals related to the gods. Where once there had been the possibility of partnership, of humans earning divine favor through heroic deeds or exceptional service, there was now only submission and appeasement. The gods had become distant again, powerful but unpredictable, helpful only when properly flattered and feared. This change in divine-mortal relations had profound consequences for human development. Instead of striving to become worthy partners of the gods, humans began to focus on avoiding divine displeasure. Innovation slowed. Heroic achievement became rarer. The collaborative spirit that had marked the early years of Zeus's reign gave way to something more like cosmic feudalism. This inconsistency became Zeus's defining characteristic. He was neither purely good nor purely evil, neither completely wise nor completely foolish. He was, in the most troubling way possible, human in his contradictions, except with the power of a god to make those contradictions matter on a cosmic scale. The king who had begun his reign as a liberator was slowly becoming something more complex and troubling. Not quite a tyrant, but no longer quite a hero. Not evil, but increasingly selfish. Not insane, but gradually losing touch with the principles that had once guided him. And the most tragic part? Zeus himself seemed largely unaware of the transformation. In his own mind, he remained the hero of his story, the liberator who had saved the cosmos from chaos. He couldn't see that his liberation had become oppression, his order had become arbitrary rule, his protection had become control. The stage was being set for the greatest challenges Zeus would face as king of the gods. Because tyranny, no matter how well-intentioned it begins, eventually creates the very rebellions it seeks to prevent. Let's talk about Zeus's love life, because no biography of the king of gods would be complete without addressing what might be mythology's most complicated dating history. Picture, if you will, a divine Tinder profile. Zeus, immortal, enjoys long walks on clouds and turning into animals. Looking for someone who won't mind sharing me with my wife and approximately 17 other ongoing relationships. Serious inquiries only. I have trust issues stemming from my father trying to eat me. The numbers alone are staggering. Depending on which ancient sources you consult, Zeus had romantic relationships with dozens of goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women. He fathered children who became major gods, minor deities, heroes, and the occasional geographical feature. His family tree looks less like a tree and more like a very tangled forest. But here's what makes Zeus's romantic adventures more than just divine soap opera material. They reveal something profound about power, consent, and the corruption that comes from having too much of both. Zeus's early relationships, the ones from his revolutionary period, were generally partnerships between equals. When he courted Métis, the Titaness of wisdom, it was a meeting of minds as much as hearts. When he married Themis, goddess of divine law, it was a political alliance that actually served the greater good. But as Zeus's power grew more absolute, his relationships became more predatory. The pattern is depressingly familiar. Zeus sees a woman he desires, Zeus takes what he wants, Zeus moves on, leaving others to deal with the consequences. The transformation disguises are particularly telling. Zeus became a bull to seduce Europa, a swan to approach Leda, golden rain to reach Danae in her tower, an eagle to carry off Ganymede. Each transformation represents a deception, a way of bypassing the woman's ability to make an informed choice about who she was dealing with. These weren't romantic gestures. They were power plays. Zeus wasn't courting these women. He was collecting them. Take the story of Europa, a Phoenician princess whose beauty caught Zeus's attention. She was playing with her friends on the beach when a magnificent white bull approached, gentle, beautiful, seemingly tame. Charmed by the creature, Europa climbed onto its back. Only then did the bull reveal its true nature, carrying her across the sea to Crete, where Zeus revealed his identity and made her his lover. Europa's story is often told as a romantic adventure, but think about it from her perspective. One moment she's a princess in her homeland, surrounded by family and friends. The next, she's stranded on a foreign island with a god who has deceived her about his identity and taken her away from everything she knew. Did she fall in love with Zeus eventually? The stories suggest she did. Did she have much choice in the matter? That's a more troubling question. This pattern repeated itself across Zeus's reign. Io transformed into a cow to hide her from Hera's jealousy. Callisto seduced when Zeus disguised himself as Artemis. Semele tricked into asking Zeus to reveal his true form, a request that killed her. Each story has its tragic elements, its moments of genuine connection, its complications that suggest these weren't simply cases of divine assault. But the power imbalance was always there, underlying every interaction. When one party is the king of the universe and the other is a mortal or minor deity, can there ever really be true consent? Hera's fury at these affairs wasn't just wifely jealousy, though it certainly included that. It was also moral outrage at seeing her husband abuse his power so consistently. Every affair was a betrayal not just of their marriage, but of the principles they had supposedly fought to establish. Her revenge was often misdirected, targeting Zeus's lovers and children rather than Zeus himself, but it served a purpose. By making Zeus's casual relationships painful and complicated, Hera was forcing him to confront the real costs of his behavior. The children of these unions bore the heaviest burden. Heracles spent his entire life performing impossible labors to atone for the circumstances of his birth. Perseus was cast into the sea as an infant. Helen became the unwilling catalyst for the Trojan War. These weren't just mythological plot devices. They were the logical consequences of having a divine parent who prioritized his own desires over his children's well-being. Some of Zeus's children thrived despite these challenges. Apollo and Artemis became major Olympian deities. Athena emerged fully grown from Zeus's head and became one of the most respected gods. Dionysus survived his traumatic birth to become the god of wine and celebration. But their success often came at tremendous personal cost. Apollo's relationships were famously tragic. Daphne transformed into a laurel tree to escape him. Cassandra cursed to prophesy truths no one would believe. Artemis swore off romantic relationships entirely, surrounding herself with virgin huntresses who shared her distrust of male attention. Even Zeus's successful children carried the marks of their complicated paternity. They were powerful, yes, but they were also isolated, struggling to form healthy relationships, prone to the same kinds of destructive patterns that had shaped their father's behavior. The divine family dynamics on Olympus became increasingly toxic as Zeus's affairs multiplied. Gods chose sides in the ongoing conflict between Zeus and Hera. Alliances shifted based on parentage and personal grudges. The collaborative spirit that had once characterized Olympian governance gave way to something more like a dysfunctional family reunion that never ended. Yet through all of this romantic chaos, Zeus maintained his authority as king. His affairs, rather than weakening his position, seemed to strengthen it in some ways. Each new relationship created new alliances, new divine bloodlines, new sources of power. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of Zeus's love life, how it revealed the ways that sexual power and political power reinforced each other. Zeus wasn't just collecting lovers. He was building a network of divine relatives who owed their existence to him. The children of his affairs often became his most loyal supporters, grateful for their divine heritage even as they struggled with its complications. The lovers themselves, transformed by their encounters with divinity, occupied a special status between mortal and divine that made them useful intermediaries. In modern terms, Zeus was engaging in what we might recognize as systematic relationship abuse, enabled by his position and power. He was creating trauma and calling it romance, leaving others to pay the emotional and practical costs of his desires. But the ancient Greeks who told these stories weren't naive about power dynamics. They understood what Zeus was doing, even if they didn't always condemn it. The stories of his affairs served as warnings about the corrupting influence of absolute power, cautionary tales about what happens when rulers believe their desires matter more than other people's lives. They also served as explanations for the complicated, often painful nature of human relationships with the divine. If even Zeus, the king of the gods, couldn't manage love without creating tragedy, what hope did mortals have of understanding the divine will? The love stories of Zeus weren't celebrations of romance. They were complex meditations on power, consent, family, and the ways that personal relationships shape political realities. They were acknowledgments that even good people can become monsters when given too much power over others. And they were reminders that the costs of such behavior are usually paid not by the powerful person who caused the damage, but by everyone else: the spurned spouses, the abandoned lovers, the children caught in the middle of conflicts they didn't create. Zeus's romantic adventures weren't separate from his political career. They were central to understanding how he evolved from a liberating revolutionary into something much more troubling, a ruler who had forgotten that other people's lives mattered as much as his own desires. Being Zeus's child was like winning a lottery where the prize might be godhood, heroic destiny, or a lifetime of supernatural persecution, and you didn't get to choose which one. The children of Zeus fell into several categories, each with its own particular burdens. There were the Olympian gods, born to divine mothers and granted full immortality and authority. There were the minor deities, powerful but not quite eligible for the inner circle of cosmic governance. And there were the heroes' half-mortal children who inherited divine strength but mortal lifespans, condemned to live extraordinary lives in ordinary time frames. Let's start with the success stories, because they illuminate just how high the stakes were for Zeus's offspring. Athena emerged fully grown from Zeus's head after he swallowed her pregnant mother, Metis. This traumatic birth origin, being literally born from her father's thoughts, shaped Athena into the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and crafts. She became one of the most respected Olympians, known for her fairness, her intellect, and her ability to resolve conflicts through clever solutions rather than brute force. But even Athena's success came with costs. She was born without a mother's influence, shaped entirely by Zeus's perspective on power and authority. She remained a virgin goddess, sworn off romantic relationships, perhaps because her understanding of love was filtered through Zeus's problematic example. Apollo and Artemis, the twin children of Leto, became major Olympians despite the circumstances of their birth. Their mother had been pursued across the earth by Hera's jealousy, unable to find sanctuary anywhere until she reached the floating island of Delos. They were born into conflict, their first breaths taken in exile and secrecy. Apollo became the god of music, prophecy, and healing, but also of plagues and sudden death. His relationships were famously tragic. Daphne was transformed into a laurel tree to escape his advances. Cassandra was cursed to prophesy truths no one would believe after she rejected him. Hyacinth was accidentally killed during a friendly competition. Artemis chose a different path entirely. She asked Zeus for eternal virginity and the wilderness as her domain, surrounding herself with hunting companions who shared her distrust of romantic entanglements. Her worship involved protecting young women from unwanted male attention, perhaps a reflection of her own family history. Both twins were powerful, respected, and influential. They were also marked by their father's legacy in ways that shaped their interactions with mortals and other gods. Apollo's failed relationships and Artemis's rejection of romance entirely can be read as responses to growing up in a family where love was often weaponized. Dionysus represents perhaps the most extreme example of Zeus's complicated parenting. Born to the mortal Semele, who was killed when she asked to see Zeus in his true form, Dionysus was sewn into Zeus's thigh to complete his gestation. He was born twice, once from his dying mother, once from his father's body. This traumatic origin story shaped Dionysus into the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. His worship involved breaking down social barriers, abandoning conventional behavior, embracing the wild and unpredictable aspects of human nature. It was as if his divinity had been shaped by the chaos of his birth, turning trauma into a kind of liberating force. But Dionysus's followers paid heavy prices for their ecstasy. The Maenads, his female worshippers, were known to tear apart anyone who opposed their rituals. King Pentheus of Thebes was killed by his own mother when she didn't recognize him during a Dionysiac frenzy. The god of wine brought joy and madness in equal measure, unable to separate celebration from destruction. Then there were the heroes, perhaps the most tragic category of Zeus's children because they inherited divine potential without divine protection. Heracles, Zeus's son by the mortal Alcmene, became the most famous hero in Greek mythology. But his heroism came at a terrible cost. Hera's persecution drove him to madness, causing him to kill his own wife and children. His 12 labors were acts of atonement, each more dangerous than the last. Heracles was stronger than any mortal, gifted with divine endurance and courage. But he was also mortal himself, subject to death, aging, and psychological trauma in ways that fully divine beings weren't. His heroic achievements were inseparable from his suffering. He saved others precisely because he couldn't save himself from the circumstances of his birth. Perseus, born to Danae after Zeus visited her in the form of golden rain, faced similar challenges. He was set adrift as an infant, grew up in exile, and was eventually tasked with killing Medusa, a quest that should have been impossible for a mortal. Perseus succeeded, but only with extensive divine assistance and a great deal of luck. The pattern repeats throughout Zeus's heroic children. Helen of Troy was born from an egg after Zeus seduced her mother Leda in the form of a swan. Her divine beauty made her the most desired woman in the world, leading directly to the Trojan War. Helen's divine heritage didn't protect her from being treated as a prize to be won rather than a person with agency. These heroes shared certain characteristics that reflected their divine parentage. They were all extraordinarily capable, stronger, smarter, or more beautiful than ordinary mortals. They all faced challenges that required supernatural abilities to overcome. And they all struggled with the isolation that came from being different from everyone around them. But they also carried the burdens of Zeus's relationship with power. Many of them became rulers who struggled with the same temptations their father had faced. Others remained perpetual outsiders, too divine for mortal society but not divine enough for Olympus. The minor deities, children like the Muses, the Fates, and the Seasons, occupied a middle ground between mortal heroes and Olympian gods. They had immortality and supernatural powers, but their authority was limited to specific domains. They served important functions in the cosmic order but remained essentially employees rather than rulers. Even these successful minor deities often carried marks of their complicated family dynamics. The Muses, goddesses of inspiration and the arts, were born from Zeus's union with Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory. They brought divine inspiration to mortals, but they could also withdraw it capriciously, leaving artists and poets struggling with creative blocks when they felt insufficiently honored. The children of Zeus reflected not just his power, but his contradictions. They were gifts to the world's sources of heroism, inspiration, wisdom, and civilization. But they were also burdens, complications, reminders that divine involvement in mortal affairs always came with costs. Many of Zeus's children spent their lives trying to prove themselves worthy of their divine heritage while simultaneously dealing with the trauma it had caused. They achieved great things, but at great personal cost. They saved others but couldn't save themselves. They inspired worship but struggled to find love. The family dynamics of Zeus's extensive offspring created ripple effects throughout Greek mythology. Sibling rivalries, inheritance disputes, and questions of legitimacy played out on a cosmic scale. The Olympian gods often took sides in these conflicts, turning personal family drama into divine politics. Modern psychology might recognize in Zeus's children the classic symptoms of children raised in chaotic, high-stress environments where love was conditional and security was never guaranteed. They overachieved to gain approval. They struggled with relationships because their primary example of love involved deception, abandonment, or violence. They often recreated the same dysfunctional patterns they had grown up with. But they also demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite the trauma of their origins, many of Zeus's children became forces for good in the world. They protected mortals, advanced civilization, and provided hope in dark times. Their struggles made them more relatable to human worshippers who faced their own difficulties with family, power, and identity. The stories of Zeus's children served multiple functions in Greek culture. They explained the origins of various gods and heroes. They provided models for how to deal with difficult family circumstances. And they offered warnings about the long-term consequences of treating relationships as means to political ends. They also reflected a sophisticated understanding of how family trauma perpetuates itself across generations. Zeus's children often struggled with the same issues their father had faced, problems with relationships, the temptation to abuse power, difficulty distinguishing between love and control. Yet some of them managed to break the cycle. Athena became a wiser ruler than Zeus in many ways, more collaborative and less prone to personal vendettas. Artemis created a community of women who supported each other rather than competing for male attention. Apollo, despite his relationship difficulties, became a patron of the arts and healing. The children of Zeus represented both the potential and the perils of divine power. They were proof that even gods couldn't escape the consequences of their actions, that every generation had to confront the mistakes of the previous one, and that sometimes the greatest heroism involved overcoming the circumstances of your own birth. They were also reminders that power without responsibility creates trauma that echoes across generations, but that trauma doesn't have to define the future. Some of Zeus's children rose above their origins to become forces for good in the world. Others were crushed by the weight of their complicated inheritance. All of them served as bridges between the divine and mortal realms, making the gods more accessible to human worshippers while making human struggles more comprehensible to divine observers. In the end, Zeus's children were perhaps his most complex legacy, neither purely good nor purely evil, but deeply human in their struggles to make sense of power, love, family, and responsibility in a world where the rules were constantly changing and the stakes were always impossibly high. Somewhere between his 1000th affair and his 10,000th thunderbolt, Zeus stopped being the god who had liberated his siblings and became something else entirely. The transformation was so gradual that it took centuries for anyone to notice, and by then it was too late to stop. The man who had once shared power now hoarded it. The revolutionary who had once listened to advice now issued decrees. The leader who had once built consensus now demanded obedience. Zeus had become exactly what he had once fought against, a tyrant who ruled through fear rather than wisdom. This wasn't a sudden corruption. It was more like erosion, the slow wearing away of principles under the constant pressure of absolute power. Each small compromise led to the next. Each exception to his own rules became a new rule. Each decision to prioritize convenience over justice made the next such decision easier. The warning signs had been there for anyone who cared to look. The brutal punishment of Prometheus for giving fire to mortals. The increasing frequency of divine interventions in mortal affairs based on personal whim rather than cosmic necessity. The way disputes were resolved through divine fiat rather than deliberation. But the most telling sign was how Zeus began to treat prophecy. In his youth, he had learned to respect the power of prophecy, even when it was inconvenient. The prediction of his father's downfall had shaped his entire early life. He understood that trying to fight fate was usually futile and always dangerous. Now, as king of the gods, Zeus began to see prophecy not as divine guidance but as a challenge to his authority. When the oracle at Delphi delivered uncomfortable truths, Zeus sometimes overruled them. When seers predicted outcomes he didn't like, he would intervene to change them, regardless of the consequences. This attitude toward prophecy revealed something crucial about Zeus's evolution as a ruler. He had stopped seeing himself as part of a larger cosmic order and started seeing himself as the cosmic order. Laws weren't principles he had to follow. They were suggestions he could modify at will. The other Olympian gods watched this transformation with growing unease. Hera's conflicts with Zeus weren't just about his infidelity anymore. They were about fundamental disagreements over how divine power should be exercised. Athena found herself having to moderate disputes that Zeus should have been mediating. Poseidon spent more time in his underwater palace, avoiding the increasingly tense atmosphere of Olympus. But direct confrontation with Zeus was increasingly difficult. He had accumulated too much power, made too many alliances, inspired too much fear. The collaborative government he had once established was slowly transforming into something more like an absolute monarchy with a divine cabinet that existed at the king's pleasure. The effects on the mortal world were profound. Instead of the relatively predictable natural order that had characterized Zeus's early reign, mortals now lived under the threat of divine caprice. Cities could be destroyed for minor slights. Heroes could be elevated or crushed based on Zeus's momentary moods. The weather itself became a reflection of the king's emotional state. Mortals adapted by becoming more cautious, more deferential, more focused on avoiding divine displeasure than on achieving divine favor. The heroic age that had flourished under Zeus's early leadership gradually gave way to something more like cosmic feudalism, where mortals served at the pleasure of gods who served at the pleasure of a king whose pleasure was increasingly unpredictable. Yet Zeus wasn't entirely without self-awareness. There were moments when he recognized what he was becoming, flashes of his old revolutionary spirit breaking through the accumulated layers of absolute power. These moments often came when he was confronted with the consequences of his own actions. The story of his confrontation with Lycaon, king of Arcadia, provides a perfect example of Zeus's complicated relationship with his own authority. Lycaon had heard stories about Zeus's frequent disguises and decided to test whether the god was really as omniscient as he claimed. So when Zeus visited in human form, Lycaon served him human flesh to see if he would notice. Zeus's response was swift and terrible. He destroyed Lycaon's palace with lightning, transformed the king into a wolf, and sent a great flood to cleanse the earth of human corruption. It was the kind of decisive, brutal action that had characterized his father Cronus's rule. But afterward, Zeus seemed to regret the severity of his response. He allowed two mortals, Deucalion and Pyrrha, to survive the flood and repopulate the earth. He established new laws governing divine-mortal interactions. He seemed, for a moment, to remember that power should serve justice rather than pride. These moments of reflection became rarer as Zeus's reign continued. The pressures of cosmic governance, the constant stream of petitions and complaints, the endless need to make decisions that affected countless lives, all of this gradually wore away his connection to his original principles. He began to delegate more authority to subordinates, but not in the collaborative way he had once practiced. Instead, he appointed gods to handle specific problems while reserving the right to overrule their decisions at any time. This created a system that was both bureaucratic and arbitrary. Gods had authority until Zeus decided they didn't. The divine court of Olympus became increasingly focused on maintaining Zeus's favor rather than on effective governance. Gods spent more time maneuvering for position and less time attending to their cosmic responsibilities. The collaboration that had once made Olympian rule effective was gradually replaced by competition for the king's attention. Zeus's relationship with his wife Hera deteriorated further as his authoritarian tendencies grew stronger. What had begun as conflicts over infidelity expanded into fundamental disagreements about the nature of power and responsibility. Hera, as queen of the gods, was supposed to be Zeus's partner in governance. Instead, she found herself increasingly marginalized, consulted only on matters Zeus deemed appropriate for her attention. Her response was to create her own power base, building alliances with gods who shared her concerns about Zeus's growing authoritarianism. This wasn't rebellion exactly, but it was resistance, a network of divine relationships that operated somewhat independently of Zeus's direct control. The tension between Zeus and Hera created fault lines throughout Olympus. Gods chose sides not based on policy disagreements but on personal loyalty and self-preservation. The divine government that had once been characterized by open debate and collaborative decision-making became increasingly polarized and secretive. Meanwhile, Zeus seemed oblivious to these dynamics, or perhaps willfully ignorant of them. He continued to make decisions as if his authority were unchallenged, as if the other gods were content with their subordinate roles, as if the system he had created were working as intended. But systems built on personal authority rather than institutional legitimacy are inherently unstable. They work only as long as the person at the center remains capable, popular, and alive. And even immortal gods can lose their capacity to lead effectively. Zeus's growing isolation from his fellow gods was paralleled by his increasing distance from mortals. Where he had once walked among humans in disguise, learning about their lives and concerns, he now observed them primarily from Olympus, seeing mortal affairs as entertainment rather than responsibility. This detachment made him less effective as a ruler and more dangerous as a god. His interventions in mortal affairs became more arbitrary, based on incomplete information and personal bias, rather than careful consideration of justice or consequences. The heroes he favored were often those who reminded him of his younger self, rebellious, powerful, willing to challenge authority. But his support for them was inconsistent, withdrawn whenever it became inconvenient or politically costly. Heroes learned not to count on divine favor, because divine favor could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. The transformation of Zeus from liberator to tyrant wasn't unique in mythological terms. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, even when the person wielding that power initially has good intentions and noble goals. But Zeus's transformation was particularly tragic because he had once understood the dangers he was succumbing to. He had lived through the tyranny of his father and grandfather. He had experienced firsthand what it felt like to be powerless under an arbitrary ruler. He had sworn to do better, yet somehow, gradually, inevitably, he had become the very thing he had once fought against. The baby who had hidden in a cave to escape being devoured had grown into a king who devoured the independence and dignity of everyone around him. The saddest part of Zeus's evolution wasn't that he became a tyrant. It was that he never seemed to realize it was happening. In his own mind, he remained the hero of his story, the liberator who had saved the cosmos from chaos. He couldn't see that his liberation had become oppression, his order had become arbitrary rule, his protection had become control. This blindness to his own transformation would ultimately set up the conditions for the greatest challenges he would face as king of the gods. Because tyranny, no matter how well-intentioned it begins, eventually creates the very rebellions it seeks to prevent. And Zeus, for all his power and experience, was about to learn that the revolutionary who had once overthrown a tyrant king might himself face revolution from those he had sworn to protect. Every morning, Zeus woke up on Olympus and had to decide the fate of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. Every day brought a stream of prayers, pleas, and petitions from mortals across the earth. Farmers begging for rain. Sailors praying for favorable winds. Warriors asking for victory. Lovers seeking divine intervention in their romantic disasters. Parents desperately pleading for their children's lives. Each prayer represented a choice. Grant this request or deny it. Intervene in this conflict or remain neutral. Save this city or let it fall. Every decision would ripple outward through time, affecting not just the immediate petitioner but countless others whose lives intersected with theirs. The mathematics of omnipotence were staggering. Help one farmer's crops grow, and you might deprive another farmer of customers. Send favorable winds to one ship, and you might blow another off course. Grant victory to one army, and you condemn the other side to defeat, slavery, or death. Zeus had never fully grasped the complexity of this moral calculus when he was fighting to overthrow his father. Revolution has a simple moral framework. The current system is bad, so anything that replaces it must be better. But governance is messier. Every choice involves trade-offs. Every action has unintended consequences. Every moment of helping someone means choosing not to help someone else. In his early years as king, Zeus had tried to make every decision based on justice, wisdom, and compassion. He had consulted with his fellow gods, weighed the evidence carefully, considered long-term consequences. But the sheer volume of decisions required had gradually worn down his commitment to this careful process. It was easier to make quick judgments based on personal preference. Simpler to help mortals who reminded him of people he liked and ignore those who didn't. More efficient to establish general policies and apply them mechanically rather than examining each case individually. But this efficiency came at a cost. The nuanced, collaborative approach to divine governance that had characterized Zeus's early reign was replaced by something more like divine bureaucracy, systematic, predictable, but often disconnected from the human realities it was supposed to serve. The Trojan War exemplifies both Zeus's power and his limitations as a cosmic decision-maker. The conflict began with a divine beauty contest, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite competing for a golden apple labeled, "for the fairest." When they asked Zeus to judge, he wisely declined, knowing that choosing any one of them would earn him the permanent enmity of the other two. Instead, he delegated the decision to Paris, a Trojan prince who was herding sheep on Mount Ida, far from the political complications of divine politics. It seemed like a clever solution: let a mortal make the choice so the gods could avoid the consequences. But Zeus's attempt to avoid responsibility only made the consequences worse. Paris chose Aphrodite, who had bribed him by promising him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. That woman turned out to be Helen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus. When Paris carried her off to Troy, he sparked a war that would last 10 years and kill hundreds of thousands of people. Zeus found himself trying to manage a conflict that involved most of the major gods, all of whom had taken sides based on their feelings about the beauty contest, their relationships with various mortal heroes, and their general political agendas. Every day of the war brought new decisions about which prayers to answer, which heroes to save, which armies to favor with good weather. The war became a kind of proxy conflict for tensions that had been building on Olympus for centuries. Hera and Athena supported the Greeks, still angry about losing the beauty contest. Aphrodite and Apollo favored the Trojans, partly out of sympathy for Paris and partly to oppose Hera and Athena. Poseidon switched sides multiple times based on personal grievances and momentary whims. Zeus tried to remain neutral, but neutrality in a conflict involving the gods was impossible. Every decision to let events take their natural course was itself a decision that favored one side or the other. Every refusal to intervene was a form of intervention. The war dragged on year after year, consuming the lives and resources of entire civilizations, largely because the gods couldn't agree on how it should end. Zeus had the power to stop it at any time. A few well-placed thunderbolts could have ended the siege of Troy in an afternoon. But ending the war would have meant overruling the other gods, potentially sparking a divine civil war that could be even more destructive. So Zeus found himself managing a mortal conflict that had spiraled far beyond any reasonable proportions, trying to balance the competing demands of gods who saw the war as entertainment, mortals who saw it as life or death struggle, and his own conscience, which recognized that his attempt to avoid responsibility had made him responsible for horrors he had never intended. The human cost of divine indecision was staggering. Heroes who should have lived died because the gods were distracted by their own conflicts. Cities that should have been spared were destroyed because their destruction served some god's personal agenda. Families were torn apart, civilizations were destabilized, and entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war, all because Zeus and his fellow gods couldn't figure out how to manage their own relationships. But the war also revealed something important about Zeus's character. Despite his growing authoritarianism, despite his personal flaws, he retained enough moral sense to be deeply troubled by the carnage he was witnessing. Several times during the war, he intervened to save individual heroes or prevent particularly brutal massacres, even when doing so contradicted his official policy of neutrality. These interventions were often small-scale and personal, saving a single warrior from death, redirecting an arrow so it wounded rather than killed, inspiring a commander to show mercy to defeated enemies. Zeus couldn't stop the war, but he could sometimes limit its cruelty. These moments of mercy revealed the remnants of the revolutionary who had once fought to create a better world. They showed that Zeus hadn't completely lost his moral compass, even if he had lost his way as a leader. But they also highlighted his isolation. Zeus's interventions were solitary decisions, made without consultation or explanation. He had become so accustomed to wielding absolute power that he no longer knew how to share decision-making, even when the decisions were too complex for any one person, even a god, to make wisely. The end of the Trojan War came finally through trickery, the famous wooden horse that allowed Greek warriors to infiltrate Troy and destroy it from within. Zeus allowed this deception to succeed, perhaps because he was exhausted by the decade-long conflict and wanted it to end regardless of which side won. But the conclusion of the war didn't resolve the underlying problems that had caused it. The gods remained fractured by their competing loyalties and personal grudges. Mortals had learned that divine favor was unreliable and that even the most powerful gods couldn't prevent suffering when they disagreed among themselves. Zeus had successfully managed a crisis, but only by allowing it to burn itself out through exhaustion rather than by providing moral leadership or systemic solutions. It was crisis management rather than governance, reactive rather than proactive. In the aftermath of the war, Zeus faced a new set of challenges. The heroes who had fought at Troy returned home changed by their experiences. Some, like Odysseus, had learned to rely on their own wit and cunning rather than divine aid. Others, like Agamemnon, had been brutalized by the violence and brought that brutalization home with them. The generation that grew up during the war had a different relationship with the gods than their parents had. They had seen divine power used capriciously, divine promises broken, divine protection fail when it was needed most. Their prayers were more cautious, their expectations lower, their faith more complicated. Zeus had to govern a world where his authority was still unquestioned, but his wisdom was increasingly doubted. Mortals obeyed the gods because they feared divine retribution, not because they trusted divine judgment. It was the beginning of a more distant, more formal relationship between the divine and mortal realms. This shift in mortal attitudes toward the gods reflected Zeus's own evolution as a ruler. The collaborative, accessible god-king of the early Olympian period was being replaced by a more remote, more arbitrary figure who made decisions based on information that mortals weren't privy to and according to logic they couldn't understand. Zeus retained his power, but he was losing his connection to the people that power was supposed to serve. And in losing that connection, he was setting up the conditions for the next phase of his long and complicated reign. Deep in the quiet hours of the night, when even gods need rest, Zeus would sometimes find himself unable to sleep. Not because of divine insomnia, but because of dreams that felt more like memories of a future he couldn't escape. The dreams always began the same way. A child born of his own blood, growing strong and clever and angry. A child who would look at Zeus with the same revolutionary fire that Zeus had once turned on his own father. A child who would gather allies, build armies, and challenge the king of the gods for his throne. These weren't random nightmares. They were prophetic visions, the kind that had shaped Zeus's entire life. The same cosmic forces that had once whispered to his grandmother Gaia about Cronus's eventual downfall were now murmuring about Zeus's own future. The prophecies were maddeningly vague, as prophecies always are. They spoke of a son who would be greater than his father. A child born to overthrow the established order. A new generation that would succeed where the previous rebellion had failed. But which son? Zeus had fathered dozens of children by mortal women, goddesses, nymphs, and titans. Each birth brought the possibility that this might be the child of prophecy. Each son who showed signs of exceptional strength or intelligence became a potential threat to consider. The rational part of Zeus's mind understood that trying to prevent prophecy was usually what caused it to come true. His own story was proof of that. Cronus's attempts to avoid being overthrown had created the very conditions that made his overthrow inevitable. But the fearful part of Zeus's mind, the part that remembered hiding in a cave, the part that still sometimes woke up thinking he could hear his father's footsteps, whispered that maybe, this time, it would be different. Maybe he could be smarter than his predecessors. Maybe he could prevent the prophecy without causing it. This internal struggle between wisdom and fear would define the later years of Zeus's reign. The king who had once shared power freely became increasingly suspicious of potential rivals. The father who had once delighted in his children's achievements began to see their successes as threats to his authority. The most dangerous prophecy involved Métis, the Titaness of wisdom who had been Zeus's first wife. Before their marriage, it had been foretold that Métis would bear 2 children, first a daughter equal to Zeus in wisdom, then a son who would surpass his father in power and eventually overthrow him. When Métis became pregnant, Zeus faced a choice that echoed his father's dilemma. He could allow the prophecy to unfold naturally, accepting the risk that his future son might indeed overthrow him. Or he could take action to prevent the birth, just as Cronus had tried to prevent his children from challenging him. Zeus chose a third option, one that revealed both his cunning and his moral flexibility. Instead of killing Métis or her unborn children, he swallowed her whole, just as his father had swallowed his siblings. But unlike Cronus, who had acted out of pure paranoia, Zeus convinced himself he was being merciful. Métis would live on inside him, her wisdom becoming part of his own. Her children would be born, but they would be born as extensions of Zeus himself rather than as independent threats. The daughter, Athena, was indeed born from Zeus's head, fully grown and armored. She became one of his most trusted advisors, brilliant and capable but ultimately loyal to her father because she had never known any other parent or perspective. The son, however, was never born. By absorbing Métis, Zeus had effectively prevented the second half of the prophecy from coming to pass. The child who was destined to overthrow him simply never came into existence. Zeus congratulated himself on this solution. He had outwitted fate itself, preventing his prophesied downfall while avoiding the crude brutality that had characterized his father's approach to the same problem. But prophecy has a way of adapting to attempts to circumvent it. If the first son of Métis couldn't be born to overthrow Zeus, then perhaps another son would fulfill the same role. The cosmic forces that shaped destiny are remarkably creative in finding alternative paths to the same destination. The next major prophetic threat came through Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty and power. Zeus was attracted to her, naturally, but before he could pursue the relationship, he received a warning from Prometheus, the Titan who had the gift of foresight. Prometheus revealed that any son born to Thetis would be greater than his father. If Zeus fathered a child with her, that child would inevitably grow up to challenge and defeat him. The prophecy was absolute, unavoidable, carved into the fabric of destiny itself. Faced with this knowledge, Zeus made perhaps his wisest decision as king. He stepped back from the relationship entirely, arranging instead for Thetis to marry a mortal, Peleus. Their son would still be greater than his father, but since his father was mortal, that greatness would be heroic rather than divine. The child born to Thetis and Peleus was Achilles, who became the greatest warrior of his generation but remained mortal despite his divine heritage. Zeus had successfully redirected a prophetic threat, turning a potential divine rival into a mortal hero who would serve the cosmic order rather than challenging it. These victories over prophecy should have reassured Zeus, but instead they seemed to make him more paranoid. If fate could be circumvented with sufficient cleverness, then every decision became a chess move in an ongoing game against destiny. Every child born carried the possibility of being the prophesied one. Every alliance formed might be setting up future betrayal. The weight of infinite vigilance began to wear on Zeus's personality. The god who had once been spontaneous and passionate became calculating and suspicious. His relationships with other gods grew more formal, more transactional. His interventions in mortal affairs became more strategic, less compassionate. He began to see patterns and threats everywhere. A particularly clever mortal hero might be gathering divine support for a rebellion. A minor god who gained popularity among mortals might be positioning himself as an alternative to Zeus's authority. Even his own children, especially his sons, became subjects of subtle scrutiny. This paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. The cosmos is full of ambitious beings who would gladly trade places with the king of the gods if they could figure out how to do it safely. But Zeus's hypervigilance against potential threats began to create the very instability he was trying to prevent. Gods who might have remained loyal began to question whether Zeus trusted them. Heroes who might have served faithfully started to wonder whether their achievements would be rewarded or seen as threatening. The collaborative spirit that had once characterized Olympian governance gave way to a more rigid hierarchy, where questioning the king's decisions became increasingly dangerous. The tragedy of Zeus's relationship with prophecy was that his very success in outwitting fate made him a worse ruler. Each prophetic crisis he navigated successfully convinced him that he was smarter than destiny, more clever than the cosmic forces that had shaped his rise to power. But prophecy, as Zeus's own story demonstrated, has a way of being fulfilled through the very attempts to prevent it. The king, who became increasingly isolated and suspicious in his attempts to avoid overthrow, was creating exactly the conditions that might eventually motivate someone to attempt that overthrow. The revolution that had brought Zeus to power had succeeded partly because Cronus had become intolerable as a ruler. His paranoia, his cruelty, his disconnection from the needs of his subjects had created a coalition of opposition that included his own family members. Zeus, in his efforts to avoid his father's fate, was slowly recreating his father's mistakes. The prophecies that haunted his dreams weren't just predicting his downfall, they were shaping him into the kind of ruler whose downfall becomes inevitable. Yet Zeus remained powerful, clever, and capable of surprising wisdom. The same intelligence that made him paranoid also made him adaptable. When he recognized that his fears were making him tyrannical, he could sometimes step back and remember the principles that had originally guided his rule. These moments of self-awareness became increasingly important as Zeus's reign continued. They were the difference between a king who was corrupted by power and one who was complicated by it, still capable of growth, still able to learn from his mistakes, still connected to the better angels of his nature even as he struggled with its demons. The prophecies that haunted Zeus were ultimately prophecies about change, about the inevitable cycle of generations, about the way power structures evolve over time. Zeus's attempts to prevent that change were understandable but ultimately futile. Change was coming whether he welcomed it or fought it. The only question was whether he would guide that change wisely or resist it until it overwhelmed him. In his better moments, Zeus understood this. He recognized that the greatest victory over prophecy wouldn't be preventing it from coming true, but making peace with the changes it predicted. The strongest king wouldn't be the one who never faced challenges to his authority, but the one who faced them with dignity and wisdom. But those better moments were becoming rarer as the weight of ruling accumulated over the centuries. Zeus was discovering that the hardest thing about being king of the gods wasn't gaining power or keeping power. It was remaining worthy of power while wielding it every day for eternity. The prophecies continued to whisper in his dreams, reminding him that every king's reign eventually ends, that every generation must give way to the next, that even gods are subject to forces larger than themselves. Zeus could hear them clearly. The question was whether he would learn from them or be destroyed by them. Imagine living forever. Not the romantic, adventurous kind of immortality you see in movies, but the real thing. Watching civilizations rise and fall like seasons. Seeing every person you care about age and die while you remain exactly the same. Making decisions every day that will echo through centuries, millennia, eons. For Zeus, immortality wasn't a gift. It was a job requirement that came with psychological costs no mortal could fully comprehend. By the time Zeus had been king of the gods for a few thousand years, he had seen empires that seemed eternal crumble into dust. He had watched languages disappear, cultures transform beyond recognition, entire peoples migrate across continents or vanish from history entirely. He had loved mortal women who had been dead for longer than most civilizations had existed. He had fathered children who had become legends, then myths, then forgotten stories told around fires that no longer burned. The accumulation of memory began to weigh on him in ways that few other beings could understand. Every face he had forgotten felt like a small betrayal. Every name that slipped from his memory was a little death. Every moment of happiness he had experienced was shadowed by the knowledge that everything good eventually ended, for everyone except him. Mortal humans deal with the passage of time by forgetting. Their memories fade naturally, allowing them to let go of past hurts and move forward into new experiences. But divine memory doesn't work that way. Zeus remembered everything with perfect clarity. Every mistake, every triumph, every moment of joy and sorrow stretched out across millennia. He remembered the exact expression on his mother Rhea's face when she handed him the wrapped stone to save his life. He could recall every detail of his first glimpse of sunlight after emerging from the cave on Crete. He remembered the precise feeling of victory when Cronus finally fell, and the weight of the crown when it was placed on his head. But he also remembered every person he had failed to save. Every prayer that had gone unanswered because he was busy with more pressing matters. Every time his personal desires had overruled his judgment as a king. Every moment when he had chosen expedience over justice. The moral weight of perfect memory was crushing. Mortals could justify their mistakes by saying they had learned from them, grown beyond them, become different people. Zeus was still the same person who had made every mistake he had ever made. The young revolutionary and the paranoid king existed simultaneously in his consciousness, their contradictions unresolved because they were both equally real, equally present, equally him. This temporal confusion affected Zeus's relationships with everyone around him. When he looked at Hera, he saw simultaneously the brilliant Titaness who had been his ally during the revolution, the passionate young goddess he had courted, the angry wife betrayed by his affairs, and the cold queen who now spoke to him primarily through formal protocols. Which version was the real Hera? They all were. All of them existed in Zeus's memory with equal vividness, creating a relationship that was layered with thousands of years of history, joy, anger, love, disappointment, and resignation. The other gods dealt with immortality in their own ways. Some, like Athena, threw themselves into their work with such intensity that they rarely had time to contemplate the passage of time. Others, like Dionysus, embraced hedonistic experiences that provided temporary escape from eternal consciousness. Hades had perhaps found the healthiest approach. Accepting his role as ruler of the dead had forced him to make peace with the cyclical nature of existence. He saw every day that life ended, but also that new life constantly began. Death wasn't tragedy, it was transition. But Zeus's position as king meant he couldn't retreat into specialized roles or philosophical detachment. He had to remain engaged with the full complexity of existence: divine politics, mortal affairs, cosmic governance, family relationships, personal desires, and prophetic responsibilities. The strain of maintaining all these responsibilities across infinite time had begun to fragment Zeus's personality. Different aspects of his character became more prominent in different contexts, as if he were wearing different masks depending on what situation required his attention. As a father, he could be caring and protective, genuinely concerned for his children's well-being. As a king, he was decisive and authoritative, focused on maintaining cosmic order. As a husband, he was often distracted and defensive, worn down by centuries of marital conflict. As a lover, he was passionate but ultimately shallow, seeking temporary escape from the weight of his other roles. These weren't conscious choices to be different people in different situations. They were psychological adaptations to the impossible task of maintaining a coherent identity across thousands of years of contradictory experiences. The mortals who worshipped Zeus began to notice this fragmentation. Different cities and cultures emphasized different aspects of his personality in their myths and rituals. Some worshipped Zeus, the wise king, others Zeus, the passionate lover, still others Zeus, the terrible judge. These weren't different gods. They were different facets of the same infinitely complex being who had lived too long and experienced too much to fit into any single narrative or personality type. The fragmentation of Zeus's identity was both a survival mechanism and a source of new problems. It allowed him to function across multiple roles and contexts, but it also made him less predictable, less reliable, less capable of the consistent moral leadership that effective governance requires. Heroes seeking his aid never knew which Zeus they would encounter. The wise king who carefully weighed justice and mercy. The paranoid tyrant who saw threats everywhere. The passionate god who made decisions based on personal attraction. The weary immortal who sometimes seemed to forget that mortal lives had meaning. This unpredictability created a new kind of distance between Zeus and the mortals he ruled. They had learned to fear divine caprice, but now they had to navigate divine complexity as well. Zeus wasn't just powerful and arbitrary, he was powerful, arbitrary, and internally contradictory. The psychological toll of immortality also affected Zeus's capacity for growth and change. Mortals develop wisdom partly through the knowledge that their time is limited, that their mistakes have permanent consequences, that they need to learn quickly because they won't have infinite chances to get things right. But Zeus had infinite time and infinite chances. Any mistake could be corrected eventually. Any relationship could be repaired given enough centuries. Any problem could be solved if he was patient enough to wait for the right circumstances. This removed much of the urgency that drives personal development. Why change today when you have eternity to improve gradually? Why confront difficult truths about yourself when you can always address them later? The result was a kind of spiritual stagnation. Zeus remained capable of learning new things, adapting to new situations, responding to new challenges. But his fundamental character, his core patterns of thought and behavior, had calcified over the millennia. He was still, at his essence, the young god who had hidden in a cave, overthrown a tyrant, and sworn to do better. But he was also the king who had gradually become isolated by power, corrupted by endless choices, and worn down by the accumulated weight of divine responsibility. The tragedy of Zeus's immortality wasn't that he had become evil or irredeemable. It was that he had become stuck, powerful enough to shape the world but no longer quite capable of. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the end of something beautiful. Not a violent ending, with crashes and explosions and dramatic final scenes. Something quieter, more melancholy. Like watching the last warm day of summer slip away into autumn, or seeing the final candle burn down at the end of a perfect evening. That's how the golden age of Zeus's reign came to a close, not with thunder and lightning, but with the slow accumulation of small disappointments and missed opportunities. The signs were subtle at first. Heroes stopped coming to Olympus seeking divine guidance. Mortals built fewer temples and offered fewer sacrifices. The great collaborative projects between gods and humans, the construction of magnificent cities, the establishment of just laws, the creation of art that captured divine beauty, these gradually gave way to more mundane concerns. It wasn't that mortals had stopped believing in the gods. If anything, their fear of divine displeasure had grown stronger over the centuries. But the relationship had changed from partnership to appeasement, from aspiration to mere survival. The heroes of the earlier age, Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, had been partners with the gods in great enterprises. They had received divine aid, yes, but they had also brought their own courage, intelligence, and moral vision to their quests. The relationship had been reciprocal, each side contributing something essential to achievements that neither could have accomplished alone. But the later generations of heroes were different. They approached the gods as petitioners rather than partners, seeking divine power to accomplish personal goals rather than cosmic purposes. The collaboration that had once characterized divine-mortal relationships was replaced by something more transactional. Zeus watched this change with growing sadness and confusion. He had tried to create a system where divine power served justice and human flourishing. Instead, he seemed to have created a system where divine power had become another resource for mortals to exploit in their competitions with each other. The blame wasn't entirely mortal. Zeus's own evolution as a ruler had contributed to the shift. His growing distance from human concerns, his increasing reliance on displays of power rather than demonstrations of wisdom, his tendency to make decisions based on personal preference rather than moral principle, all of this had taught mortals to see the gods as forces to be appeased rather than ideals to be emulated. The divine court on Olympus had grown more formal and hierarchical over the centuries. The early councils where gods debated policy and strategy gave way to audiences where Zeus announced decisions that had already been made. The collaborative spirit that had once characterized Olympian governance was replaced by something that looked more like a traditional royal court. This change affected the quality of divine decision-making. Zeus was brilliant, but no single mind, even a divine one, could process all the information needed to govern a cosmos effectively. The insights and perspectives of other gods had once corrected his blind spots and challenged his assumptions. Now those insights were filtered through layers of protocol and political calculation before they reached him. Hera, who had once been Zeus's most trusted advisor and sharpest critic, increasingly communicated with him through formal channels rather than direct conversation. Their personal conflicts had poisoned their professional relationship, depriving Zeus of the intellectual partnership that had once made him a more effective ruler. The other gods adapted to this new environment by developing their own independent power bases. Athena cultivated relationships with mortal rulers and philosophers. Apollo established a network of oracles and artists. Aphrodite influenced romantic relationships across the Mediterranean. Each god became, in effect, the ruler of their own specialized domain within Zeus's larger kingdom. This distributed approach to divine governance had advantages. It allowed for more specialized expertise and reduced Zeus's workload. But it also created coordination problems and jurisdictional conflicts. Gods pursued policies that served their particular interests without always considering how those policies affected the larger cosmic order. Zeus found himself spending more time mediating disputes between gods and less time actually governing the cosmos. He was becoming less a king and more a referee, managing conflicts rather than leading collaborative efforts toward shared goals. The fragmentation of divine authority had profound effects on mortal civilization. Instead of receiving coherent guidance from a unified pantheon, mortals learned to navigate a complex system where different gods might give contradictory advice about the same problem. A warrior might receive encouragement from Ares to pursue battle while simultaneously being warned by Athena to proceed cautiously. A lover might be inspired by Aphrodite to pursue their desires while being advised by Artemis to maintain their independence. A farmer might pray to Demeter for abundant crops while needing to appease Poseidon to prevent earthquakes. This complexity made mortal life more difficult and less predictable. The clear moral framework that had characterized the early relationship between gods and humans gave way to a more ambiguous system where success required political skill as much as moral virtue. Zeus recognized these problems but struggled to address them. Reasserting direct control over the other gods would have required him to acknowledge that his more hands-off approach had been a mistake. It would have meant reversing centuries of precedent and potentially sparking conflicts with gods who had grown accustomed to their independence. Instead, Zeus tried to manage the symptoms while ignoring the underlying causes. He intervened more frequently in mortal affairs, trying to correct problems through direct divine action rather than systematic reform. But these interventions often created new complications without resolving the fundamental issues. The Trojan War exemplified both Zeus's power and his limitations during this period. He had the ability to influence the course of the conflict, but he struggled to control its overall direction because too many other gods had their own agendas. The war dragged on for 10 years partly because the divine realm was too fractured to impose a coherent resolution. Zeus's personal life during this period reflected the same patterns as his public leadership. His affairs became more frequent but less meaningful, as if he were seeking in temporary romantic connections the kind of intimate partnership that his marriage to Hera no longer provided. But these relationships couldn't fill the emotional void created by his isolation as a ruler. If anything, they made the problem worse by further alienating Hera and creating additional sources of conflict within the divine family. The children born from these later affairs often struggled more than Zeus's earlier offspring. They were born into a more complex and politically charged environment, where divine parentage was as likely to be a burden as a blessing. They faced higher expectations but received less consistent support from their father, who was increasingly distracted by the demands of cosmic governance. Zeus began to experience something that mortal rulers know well but that gods rarely face: the loneliness of leadership. The higher he rose in power and authority, the fewer genuine relationships he was able to maintain. The weight of his responsibilities isolated him from the kind of honest feedback and emotional support that effective leadership requires. The tragedy of Zeus's later reign wasn't that he became evil or incompetent. He remained powerful, intelligent, and generally well-intentioned. The tragedy was that he became disconnected from his original principles, from his family relationships, from his fellow gods, and from the mortals he was supposed to serve. This disconnection made him less effective as a ruler and less fulfilled as a person. He retained all the formal prerogatives of kingship but lost much of its substance. He could still command obedience, but he struggled to inspire genuine loyalty. He could still make decisions that shaped the cosmos, but he had less confidence that those decisions were wise. The Golden Age didn't end with a catastrophic event or a dramatic confrontation. It ended with the gradual realization that the collaborative, idealistic system Zeus had tried to create was slowly transforming into something more ordinary and less inspiring. The gods were still gods, mortals still worshipped them, and the cosmos still functioned according to divine will. But the magic was fading. The sense of infinite possibility that had characterized the early years of Zeus's reign was being replaced by a more limited understanding of what divine power could actually accomplish. Zeus had learned to rule the cosmos, but in the process, he had somehow lost the vision that had once made that rule seem worthwhile. The revolutionary who had once fought to create a better world had become a manager trying to maintain a system that no longer quite worked. The twilight of the Golden Age was really the story of Zeus's gradual disenchantment with his own success. He had achieved everything he had set out to achieve, but the achievement felt hollow. He had gained the whole world but lost something essential about himself in the process. And in the growing darkness of that twilight, new challenges were emerging that would test not just Zeus's power, but his capacity to remember who he had once been and who he still might become. For all of Zeus's fears about prophecy and overthrow, for all his paranoia about potential rivals and rebellious children, the great revolution he dreaded never actually materialized. Not because he successfully prevented it, but because he had fundamentally misunderstood what the prophecies were trying to tell him. The son who would be greater than his father didn't need to overthrow Zeus to fulfill that destiny. He could simply be better at being a god, wiser, more compassionate, more connected to the people he served. The threat Zeus feared wasn't political rebellion but moral evolution. This realization came gradually, through a series of encounters with his own children that forced him to confront the difference between power and greatness. Heracles, despite all his suffering at Hera's hands, became a hero who saved people rather than ruling them. Apollo, for all his flaws, created beauty and knowledge that outlasted any military conquest. Athena built institutions and systems that served justice more consistently than any individual ruler ever could. Each of these children was, in their own way, greater than Zeus not because they had more power, but because they used their power more wisely. They had learned from their father's mistakes without having to repeat them. They had found ways to be divine that didn't require the isolation and moral compromise that had characterized Zeus's reign. The prophecies hadn't been predicting Zeus's downfall. They had been predicting his redemption through his children's example. The next generation wouldn't need to overthrow him because they had already surpassed him in the ways that actually mattered. This understanding came too late to fundamentally change Zeus's approach to leadership, but it did give him a different perspective on his legacy. He began to see his children's achievements not as threats to his authority, but as fulfillments of his original revolutionary ideals. They were building the better world he had once dreamed of creating. The irony was profound. Zeus had spent centuries fearing that his children would destroy him, when in fact they were completing him. The revolution he had started by overthrowing his father was being finished by his own offspring, not through violence but through example. Heracles' 12 labors weren't just acts of atonement for his madness. They were demonstrations of what divine power could accomplish when it was dedicated to serving others rather than dominating them. Each monster he defeated, Each impossible task he completed was a reminder that true strength came from protection rather than conquest. Apollo's patronage of the arts wasn't just cultural development, it was an investment in human potential that would outlast any political achievement. The music he inspired, the poetry he nurtured, the healing arts he advanced, these were gifts that enriched mortal life in ways that no amount of divine intervention could match. Athena's wisdom wasn't just clever problem-solving, it was a different approach to power entirely. Where Zeus often relied on force or authority to resolve conflicts, Athena used intelligence, negotiation, and systemic thinking. She created solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Even Dionysus, the god of apparent chaos and abandon, represented a crucial insight about leadership that Zeus had struggled to understand. True authority couldn't be imposed from above. It had to emerge from genuine connection with the people being led. Dionysus's followers chose to follow him not because they feared him, but because he offered them experiences they couldn't find elsewhere. As Zeus watched his children surpass him in their various domains, he began to understand that the prophecies had never been threats at all. They had been promises. Promises that the next generation would learn from his mistakes, that they would find better ways to wield divine power, that the world would continue to improve even if he himself had reached the limits of his own growth. This realization brought Zeus a kind of peace he hadn't experienced since his early years as king. The constant vigilance against potential threats could finally relax. The paranoid calculation of every relationship could give way to something more like trust. The fear of being overthrown could be replaced by pride in having raised children capable of doing better than he had done. But the peace came with its own kind of sadness. Zeus realized that he had wasted centuries worrying about the wrong things. While he had been guarding against external threats to his authority, the real challenge had been internal, the slow erosion of his connection to the principles that had originally motivated his rise to power. His children had succeeded where he had failed not because they were inherently better than him, but because they had been able to learn from his example without being corrupted by his experiences. They had seen what absolute power could do to someone and had chosen different paths. The rebellion that never came was perhaps more devastating to Zeus's ego than any actual overthrow would have been. To be defeated in battle would have been tragic but comprehensible. To be surpassed through moral growth was harder to accept, because it suggested that his failures as a leader weren't inevitable consequences of divine authority but personal choices he had made along the way. Yet even this painful recognition contained seeds of hope. If his children could surpass him, if they could find better ways to be divine, then perhaps he too could still learn and grow. Perhaps the story of Zeus wasn't over, but simply entering a new chapter. The prophecies had been fulfilled, but not in the way anyone had expected. The next generation had indeed proven greater than their father, but their greatness had elevated rather than destroyed him. They had shown Zeus what he might become if he could rediscover the idealism that had once driven his revolution against tyranny. Fast forward to today, and Zeus's story continues to resonate because the challenges he faced haven't disappeared. Every person who gains authority, whether in government, business, family, or community, faces the same fundamental choice that defines Zeus's reign. Will they use their power to serve something greater than themselves, or will they gradually become corrupted by it? Modern leaders struggle with the same isolation that plagued Zeus. The higher you rise in any hierarchy, the fewer honest advisors you have, the more filtered your information becomes, the more your decisions are shaped by political calculation rather than moral clarity. The CEO in the corner office faces a milder version of the same challenges that confronted the king of the gods. We see Zeus's pattern repeated in contemporary politics, where revolutionary leaders often become the established authorities that future revolutionaries oppose. The idealist who comes to power promising change gradually becomes pragmatic, then cynical, then defensive of a system they once sought to transform. We see it in families, where parents who swore to do better than their own parents find themselves repeating similar patterns, despite their best intentions. The cycle of generational trauma and dysfunction that characterized Zeus's family continues to play out in living rooms and therapy sessions across the world. We see it in relationships, where people who begin with genuine love and mutual respect gradually develop the same kinds of power imbalances and emotional distance that made Zeus and Hera's marriage such a source of cosmic conflict. Zeus's story offers no easy solutions to these problems, but it does offer something valuable: the recognition that these struggles are universal and eternal. Every generation faces them. Every individual with any measure of power confronts them. The specific details change, but the fundamental challenges remain constant. The technology executives who built platforms to connect people but now struggle with the unintended consequences of social media manipulation are walking in Zeus's footsteps. The environmental activists who become so focused on their cause that they lose sight of the human costs of their advocacy are repeating his mistakes. The parents who become so concerned with protecting their children that they end up controlling them are caught in the same trap. But Zeus's story also shows us that these patterns aren't inevitable. Some of his children manage to break the cycle, to use power more wisely, to learn from his mistakes without repeating them. This suggests that growth is possible, that wisdom can be gained, that each generation has the opportunity to do better than the last. The key insight from Zeus's life might be this: power doesn't corrupt automatically, but it does corrupt unless it's actively resisted. The corruption comes not from sudden moral failures, but from thousands of small compromises, each individually justifiable but collectively transformative. Zeus's transformation from liberator to tyrant wasn't the result of a single moment of evil, but of countless moments when he chose convenience over principle, efficiency over justice, personal desire over public good. Each choice seemed reasonable at the time, but together they changed who he was. Modern leaders face the same progression of small choices. The politician who starts with idealistic goals but gradually learns to work within a corrupt system. The business leader who begins with a mission to serve customers but slowly becomes focused on serving shareholders. The parent who starts with intentions to nurture their child's independence but gradually becomes overprotective. Understanding Zeus's story can help us recognize these patterns in our own lives and resist them. Not by being perfect, Zeus's tale shows us that perfection is impossible, but by remaining aware of the forces that tend to corrupt power and actively working to counter them. This might mean deliberately seeking out advisors who will tell us uncomfortable truths, creating systems that limit our own authority, regularly returning to the principles that originally motivated us, accepting that our children, students, or successors might find better ways to accomplish what we're trying to do. Zeus's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of power. It's also a reminder that even flawed leaders can create positive change, that even failed systems can lay the groundwork for better ones, and that the measure of a life isn't perfection but growth. The baby who was almost eaten by his father grew up to overthrow a tyrant and establish a new order. The revolutionary who became isolated by power still managed to father children who surpassed him in wisdom and compassion. The king who lost his way nevertheless created conditions that allowed others to find theirs. In our own lives, we may not achieve everything we set out to accomplish. We may make mistakes, become corrupted by whatever power we wield, disappoint the people who believe in us. But if we can create space for the next generation to do better, if we can leave behind examples of both what to emulate and what to avoid, then perhaps our failures can become foundations for others' success. Zeus's thunder still rolls across the sky when storms gather. Lightning still splits the darkness during the fierce weather that shapes our world. And somewhere, In whatever realm gods inhabit in our modern understanding, Zeus still wrestles with the eternal questions of power, responsibility, love, and justice. His story continues because those questions continue. Every generation faces the same fundamental challenges he faced: how to use whatever power we have wisely, how to balance competing demands and desires, how to remain connected to our values when circumstances pressure us to abandon them. And so we reach the end of our journey through the life of Zeus, though for Zeus himself, there is no end, only continuation. He sits even now on his throne atop Mount Olympus, watching over a world that has changed beyond recognition from the one he first learned to rule. The mortals below no longer build temples in his honor or offer sacrifices at his altars. They have found new gods to worship, new stories to tell, new ways to explain the thunder and lightning that roll across their skies. But Zeus remains, because gods don't retire, don't abdicate, don't get to say, "I've had enough," and walk away into a peaceful sunset. The baby who was almost eaten by his father has become the eternal king who can never stop being king. The revolutionary who overthrew a tyrant has become the established authority that future revolutionaries might one day challenge. The young god who swore to do better than his predecessors has learned that good intentions are not enough to guarantee good outcomes. Zeus's story is ultimately a story about power, how we gain it, how we use it, how it changes us, and how we live with the consequences of wielding it. It's a story that remains relevant because the questions it raises are eternal questions that every generation must answer for itself. How do we balance individual desires with collective responsibilities? How do we maintain our principles when circumstances pressure us to compromise them? How do we stay connected to the people we're supposed to serve when authority naturally isolates us from their experiences? Zeus never found perfect answers to these questions. His reign was marked by brilliant successes and tragic failures, moments of profound wisdom and periods of devastating blindness. He saved the cosmos from tyranny and then struggled not to become a tyrant himself. He created systems of justice and then sometimes ignored them for personal convenience. But perhaps the point isn't to find perfect answers. Perhaps the point is to keep asking those questions, to keep struggling with them, to keep trying to do better even when better is an impossibly moving target. The mortals who first told Zeus's story understood this. They didn't create a perfect god who always made the right choices. They created a complex character who embodied both human potential and human limitations, magnified to cosmic proportions. Zeus represents what we might become if we had unlimited power, brilliant and flawed, capable of great good and great harm, forever wrestling with the gap between our ideals and our actions. His story is both a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and an inspiring reminder that even gods can grow, learn, and sometimes transcend their worst impulses. The king of the gods never stopped being the baby who hid in a cave, never stopped being the young revolutionary who swore to do better, never stopped being the lover who got distracted by beauty, never stopped being the father who struggled to balance personal desires with family responsibilities. All of these versions of Zeus existed simultaneously in his immortal consciousness, creating the complexity and contradiction that made him both more and less than human. More because of his power and wisdom, less because of his isolation from the cycles of growth, loss, and renewal that give mortal life its meaning. In the end, Zeus's greatest achievement wasn't overthrowing his father or establishing divine rule, or even maintaining cosmic order for millennia. His greatest achievement was remaining recognizably himself despite having more power than any being should reasonably possess. He made mistakes, terrible ones. He caused suffering, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes through willful blindness to consequences he should have foreseen. He failed to live up to his own ideals more often than he succeeded. But he never stopped trying. Even in his worst moments, Some part of Zeus remembered the principles that had guided his revolution, the vision of a better world that had motivated his struggle against tyranny. Even when he acted like a tyrant himself, he was capable of recognizing his failures and attempting to correct them. This capacity for self-awareness and growth, however limited, is what separates Zeus from the truly monstrous rulers of mythology. Cronus had become so consumed by fear and paranoia that he lost all connection to anything beyond his own survival. Uranus had retreated so far from the world he was supposed to govern that he became a distant, indifferent force rather than a caring ruler. Zeus never completely lost his connection to the world or his capacity for moral reasoning. He remained engaged, conflicted, struggling, which made him frustrating but also, ultimately, sympathetic. The thunder still rolls across the sky when storms gather. Lightning still splits the darkness during the fierce weather that shapes our world. And somewhere, in whatever realm gods inhabit in our modern understanding, Zeus still wrestles with the eternal questions of power, responsibility, love, and justice. His story continues because those questions continue. Every generation faces the same fundamental challenges he faced: how to use whatever power we have wisely, how to balance competing demands and desires, how to remain connected to our values when circumstances pressure us to abandon them. We may not be gods, but we all have some measure of power over our own lives and the lives of others. We all face moments when we must choose between what we want and what we know is right. We all struggle with the gap between our ideals and our actions. In that struggle, Zeus remains our companion, not as a perfect example to emulate, but as a complex character whose failures and successes illuminate the eternal difficulty and importance of trying to do better, even when better is impossibly hard to define. So the next time you hear thunder rolling across the sky, remember Zeus not as a distant divine figure, but as a reminder that power is both a gift and a burden, that leadership is both a privilege and a trap, and that the most important battles are often the ones we fight within ourselves. Sleep well, knowing that even the king of the gods never figured it all out, but never stopped trying. And in that endless effort to grow, to improve, to become worthy of the power we wield in that eternal struggle, we find not answers, but something more valuable: the courage to keep asking the right questions. The story of Zeus is complete, but the questions it raises echo on forever. Sweet dreams.